The year is 1347, and you've just opened your eyes in a small, windowless room that reeks of human waste, rotting straw, and something else you can't quite identify but desperately wish you couldn't smell. Your head throbs from what feels like the worst hangover of your life, except you haven't touched a drop of alcohol. The pain shooting through your joints tells you that your body has been working harder than any modern person could imagine, and you haven't even gotten out of bed yet. Congratulations! You've just experienced your first 30 seconds of medieval life, and you're already in more danger than you've ever been in your entire modern existence. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig deep into history's most fascinating and terrifying truths. I'm your host, and I'm about to take you on a journey that will make you appreciate every single convenience of modern life, from your morning coffee to the simple act of turning on a light switch. Because the brutal reality is this: if you were somehow transported back to medieval times, the odds of you surviving even a single day would be astronomically low. You see, we've been fed a romanticized version of medieval life through movies, books, and television shows. We imagine noble knights, grand castles, and perhaps a bit of rustic charm. But the truth is far more sinister, far more dangerous, and far more likely to kill you in ways you never imagined possible. Let me paint you the real picture of what your day would actually look like, starting from the moment you wake up in that putrid room I just described. Your eyes adjust to the darkness, and you realize that what you initially thought was a bed is actually a pile of straw on the dirt floor, covered by a coarse woolen blanket that feels like it's made of steel wool. This straw hasn't been changed in months, and it's become a thriving ecosystem of fleas, lice, mites, and other parasites that have already begun making your body their new home. The itching is unbearable, but scratching only makes it worse, often opening wounds that, in this filthy environment, will almost certainly become infected. But here's where it gets interesting. That straw beneath you isn't just uncomfortable, it's potentially lethal. Medieval people rarely changed their bedding, and over time, the straw would begin to ferment and rot, creating the perfect breeding ground for bacteria and fungi. Some historians believe that a significant number of mysterious medieval deaths were actually caused by what we now know as histoplasmosis, a fungal infection caused by breathing in spores from decomposing organic matter. You've been breathing these spores all night long. As you struggle to sit up, you notice something that would send most modern people into a complete panic. There are other people in this room. Not family members, mind you, but complete strangers. Privacy, as we understand it, simply didn't exist for the vast majority of medieval people. Entire families would share a single room, and it wasn't uncommon for travelers, servants, or even animals to share the same sleeping space. That person coughing violently next to you? They might have tuberculosis, pneumonia, or any number of other highly contagious diseases that would kill you long before any medieval physician could even attempt a diagnosis. Speaking of which, let's talk about that cough for a moment. In 1347, something was spreading across Europe that would kill 1/3 of the entire population. The Black Death had arrived, and if you were unlucky enough to wake up in that particular year, the chances of you being dead within a week weren't just possible. They were probable. But here's the terrifying part. You wouldn't even know what was killing you. Medieval people had no understanding of germs, bacteria, or how diseases spread. They blamed everything from bad air to God's wrath to the alignment of the planets. But let's assume you're fortunate enough to avoid the plague. You still need to get through the rest of your day, and the challenges are just beginning. You stumble to your feet, and immediately your modern sensibilities are assaulted by the complete absence of anything resembling sanitation. That smell you couldn't identify earlier? It's human waste. Medieval homes didn't have bathrooms, toilets, or any kind of proper sewage system. If you were lucky enough to be in a castle or wealthy household, there might be a garderobe, essentially a hole in the wall that dropped waste directly into a moat or pit below. But for most people, chamber pots were emptied into the streets, creating rivers of sewage that flowed directly past where people lived, worked, and prepared food. The concept of toilet paper wouldn't be invented for another several hundred years, so people used whatever was available. Leaves, moss, their own clothing, or sometimes just their hands. The idea of washing those hands afterward was not just uncommon, it was virtually unknown. In fact, many medieval people believed that bathing was actually dangerous to your health, opening up your pores to disease and evil spirits. This brings us to one of the most shocking realities of medieval life. Personal hygiene was not just poor, it was deliberately avoided. The average medieval person might bathe once or twice a year, if at all. They believed that a layer of dirt and grime actually protected them from illness. Their hair was often crawling with lice, their teeth were rotting out of their heads, and their clothing was never washed, only occasionally aired out or beaten to remove some of the filth. But here's where modern people would face a particularly cruel irony. Your skin, accustomed to daily showers, antibacterial soaps, and clean clothing, would be incredibly vulnerable to the bacterial onslaught of medieval life. Within hours, you'd likely develop rashes, infections, and skin conditions that medieval people had built up some resistance to over their lifetimes. Your soft, clean hands would be shredded by the rough work required to survive, and those wounds would become infected almost immediately. Now, let's talk about breakfast, because you're probably feeling hungry after all this talk of medieval sleeping arrangements. But I should warn you, medieval food is going to challenge every assumption you have about what constitutes safe eating. You make your way to what passes for a kitchen, which is likely just a fire pit in the center of the room, with a hole in the roof to let out some of the smoke. The air is thick and choking, filled with particles that are slowly destroying your lungs with every breath. But you need food, so you approach the cooking area where someone is preparing the morning meal. The first thing you notice is that everything looks wrong. The bread is dark, dense, and filled with what appear to be small stones and pieces of straw. This isn't a mistake, it's normal. Medieval grain was often contaminated with ergot, a fungus that could cause hallucinations, seizures, and death. The stones and debris weren't removed because people simply didn't have the tools or knowledge to properly clean their grain. Eating this bread is like playing Russian roulette, except some of the chambers are definitely loaded. But bread might be the safest thing on the table. The meat, if there is any, has been preserved using methods that would horrify modern food safety inspectors. Without refrigeration, meat was either eaten immediately after slaughter or preserved using salt, smoke, or by letting it air dry in conditions that encourage the growth of beneficial bacteria while hopefully preventing the growth of harmful ones. The key word here is hopefully. Medieval people had no understanding of foodborne illness. They couldn't see bacteria, and they had no concept of cross-contamination. The same knife used to butcher an animal might be used to cut bread. The same hands that handled raw meat would prepare other foods, and the same surfaces would be used for everything, from food preparation to medical procedures. And then there's the water. Oh, the water. This might be the single most dangerous thing you'll encounter all day, and you absolutely must drink it to survive. Medieval people knew that water could make you sick, but they had no idea why. They often chose to drink beer or ale instead, not because they were alcoholics, but because the brewing process made these beverages safer than water. But even alcoholic drinks were often contaminated, and the alcohol content was usually too low to kill dangerous bacteria. If you're forced to drink water, you're essentially gambling with your life. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid fever. These diseases spread through contaminated water supplies, and they killed with terrifying efficiency. The symptoms would start within hours: violent stomach cramps, uncontrollable diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration. Without modern medical intervention, your chances of survival would be slim. But let's say you somehow managed to choke down a medieval breakfast without immediately falling ill. Now comes the next challenge: finding work. Because in medieval times, if you don't work, you don't eat. And I can guarantee you that whatever job you're assigned will be more dangerous than anything you've ever experienced in the modern world. If you're male and of fighting age, congratulations. You might be conscripted into military service. Medieval warfare was brutal beyond imagination. Forget the romanticized sword fights you see in movies. Real medieval combat was desperate, chaotic, and overwhelmingly likely to end in your death or permanent disability. Swords were expensive and relatively rare. Most soldiers fought with whatever they could find. Farming tools converted into weapons, clubs, spears made from sharpened sticks. Even if you survived the battle, you were likely to die from your wounds afterward. Medieval medicine was not just primitive, it was often actively harmful. Physicians believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily humors, and their treatments included bloodletting, purging, and the application of substances that were often more toxic than the original ailment. A simple cut that would heal easily with modern first aid could turn into a life-threatening infection in medieval times. But perhaps you'll avoid military service and instead be assigned to agricultural work. Surely farming is safer than fighting. Not in medieval times. Medieval agriculture was backbreaking labor performed with primitive tools that were almost designed to injure the people using them. Scythes, sickles, and other farming implements had no safety features and were maintained poorly, if at all. A dull blade required more force to use, making accidents more likely and more severe. The work itself was performed in all weather conditions. There were no sick days in medieval times, no workers' compensation, no safety regulations. If you were injured on the job, you were simply replaced. Hernias were common and often fatal. Back injuries were endemic, and the constant exposure to the elements led to arthritis, pneumonia, and other conditions that would plague workers for their short lifespans. And those lifespans were indeed short. The average life expectancy in medieval times was somewhere between 25 and 35 years, but this statistic is actually misleading because it includes infant mortality. If you survived to adulthood, you might live into your 40s or 50s, but you'd spend most of that time in chronic pain from injuries and conditions that modern medicine can easily treat. But here's something that might surprise you. Some of the most dangerous jobs in medieval times were ones we consider safe today. Take being a baker, for instance. You might think kneading dough and tending ovens sounds pleasant compared to farming or fighting, but medieval bakers faced unique hazards that could kill them in horrible ways. The ovens used for baking were massive stone structures heated by wood fires. They had no temperature controls, no safety mechanisms, and no proper ventilation. Bakers regularly suffered severe burns, smoke inhalation, and carbon monoxide poisoning. The flour they worked with was often contaminated with insects, rodents, and their droppings, leading to respiratory diseases that would slowly destroy their lungs. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of being a medieval baker was the constant threat of explosion. When flour dust accumulates in the air and comes into contact with an open flame, it can explode with devastating force. Medieval bakers had no understanding of this phenomenon, and bakery explosions were common enough that they were often attributed to supernatural causes. As your workday progresses, you begin to notice something that would be deeply unsettling to modern sensibilities: the omnipresence of death. In medieval times, death wasn't hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes. It was everywhere, all the time. Children died regularly from diseases that are now prevented by simple vaccinations. Women died in childbirth at rates that would be considered catastrophic today. Adults died from injuries and illnesses that modern medicine considers minor inconveniences. This constant proximity to death created a medieval mindset that modern people would find deeply disturbing. Life was considered cheap, violence was commonplace, and the suffering of others was often seen as entertainment. Public executions were social events, torture was an accepted form of justice, and animal cruelty was so normalized that it was practiced for fun. But perhaps nowhere was the brutality of medieval life more apparent than in the legal system. If you were accused of a crime in medieval times, you were presumed guilty until proven innocent, and the methods used to prove innocence were often more dangerous than the original crime. Trial by ordeal was a common practice that relied on divine intervention to determine guilt or innocence. You might be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar in your bare hands, plunge your arm into boiling water, or be bound and thrown into a river. If you survived without injury, you were innocent. If you were injured or died, you were guilty. The logic was that God would protect the innocent and punish the guilty, but the reality was that these ordeals were essentially torture that often killed innocent people. Even if you somehow avoided legal troubles, you still had to navigate the complex social hierarchy of medieval society, where a single misstep could result in severe punishment or death. Insulting a noble, failing to show proper deference, or even making eye contact with the wrong person could be considered a serious offense. The punishments for these social infractions were horrifyingly creative. Medieval people had developed an entire science of torture and execution that was designed to maximize suffering while serving as a deterrent to others. Drawing and quartering, burning at the stake, flaying alive, these weren't just methods of execution, they were public spectacles designed to terrorize the population into submission. As the day wears on, you begin to feel the effects of the medieval environment on your body. Your muscles ache from unaccustomed labor, your skin burns from exposure to harsh chemicals and rough materials, and your lungs struggle with the constant inhalation of smoke, dust, and other airborne contaminants. But perhaps most challenging of all is the psychological toll of medieval life. The constant fear, the absence of privacy, the lack of any real control over your circumstances. These would quickly break down the mental defenses that modern people rely on to cope with stress and uncertainty. Medieval people developed coping mechanisms that modern psychology would recognize as symptoms of severe trauma. Superstition, religious fanaticism, and acceptance of extreme violence were all ways of dealing with a world that was fundamentally unpredictable and dangerous. As evening approaches, you face another challenge that modern people rarely consider: how to stay warm and safe through the night. Medieval homes had no central heating, no electric lights, and no security systems. Firewood was expensive and often in short supply, so most people simply endured the cold, even in the depths of winter. The darkness was absolute and terrifying. Without electric lighting, the night belonged to criminals, wild animals, and other dangers that most people chose not to think about too closely. Streets were unlit and often impassable, filled with human waste, animal carcasses, and other hazards that could injure or kill an unwary traveler. But even staying indoors offered little safety. Medieval homes were fire traps, built primarily of wood and thatch with open flames providing the only sources of light and heat. House fires were common and often fatal, not just because of the flames themselves, but because medieval people had no understanding of smoke inhalation or other fire-related hazards. The air inside medieval homes was thick with smoke from cooking fires, oil lamps, and candles. This constant exposure to airborne toxins led to respiratory diseases that slowly destroyed people's lungs over their lifetimes. Modern people, accustomed to clean air and proper ventilation, would likely develop severe breathing problems within days of exposure to these conditions. And then there's the food again. Because you need to eat dinner, and medieval dinner options are no safer than medieval breakfast options. In fact, they might be worse because any food prepared earlier in the day has now had additional hours to develop dangerous bacteria in the absence of refrigeration. Medieval people had developed some strategies for food preservation, but these methods often introduced new dangers. Salted meats were loaded with sodium that could cause high blood pressure and other cardiovascular problems. Smoked foods contained compounds that we now know are carcinogenic. Pickled vegetables were preserved in solutions that were often contaminated with harmful bacteria. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of medieval dining was the complete absence of food safety knowledge. Cross-contamination was universal, food storage was primitive, and the concept of expiration dates didn't exist. Medieval people ate food that would send modern health inspectors into complete panic, and they did it every single day of their lives. As you prepare for sleep, you realize that you've somehow survived an entire day in medieval times, but your survival has come at a tremendous cost. Your body is broken, your health is compromised, and you've been exposed to countless dangers that could still kill you days or weeks later. But here's the most sobering thought of all. What you've experienced isn't even close to the worst that medieval life could offer. You've avoided the plague, escaped serious injury, and managed to find enough food to keep you alive. Millions of medieval people weren't so fortunate. You haven't experienced a medieval winter when the cold could literally freeze you to death in your own home. You haven't lived through a famine when people would eat grass, bark, and even human flesh to avoid starvation. You haven't endured a siege when entire cities would be cut off from food and water until the population was reduced to cannibalism. You haven't experienced the particular horrors that awaited medieval women, who faced additional dangers from pregnancy and childbirth that killed them at rates that would be considered genocidal by modern standards. You haven't experienced the systematic persecution that could target you for your religion, your ethnicity, or simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And perhaps most importantly, you haven't experienced the hopelessness that characterized medieval life for most people. The understanding that your circumstances would never improve, that your children would face the same dangers and hardships that you faced, that death could come at any moment from causes beyond your understanding or control. Modern people often romanticize the past, imagining simpler times when life was more meaningful and communities were stronger. But the reality is that medieval life was a daily struggle against forces that were actively trying to kill you. Disease, starvation, violence, and accident were constant threats that most people simply accepted as unavoidable parts of existence. The average medieval person lived in a state of chronic stress that would be diagnosed as severe anxiety or depression by modern mental health professionals. They developed coping mechanisms that helped them survive, but these same mechanisms would be considered pathological in our current society. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about medieval people isn't that they lived such harsh lives, but that they managed to create anything beautiful or meaningful despite the constant threat of death and suffering. The art, literature, architecture, and music that survived from medieval times represent triumphs of human creativity over circumstances that would crush most modern people. But make no mistake, these achievements came at an enormous human cost. For every cathedral that was built, thousands of workers died from accidents, disease, and exhaustion. For every beautiful illuminated manuscript that was created, countless scribes ruined their eyes and hands in cold, damp scriptoriums. For every piece of music that was composed, countless musicians lived and died in poverty and obscurity. The medieval period lasted for roughly 1,000 years from the fall of the Roman Empire to the beginning of the Renaissance. During that time, billions of people lived and died under conditions that modern people would consider intolerable. They faced challenges that we can barely imagine, and they did so without any of the tools, knowledge, or resources that we take for granted. Your single day in medieval times would give you just a tiny glimpse into this world of suffering and endurance. But it would be enough to make you appreciate every single aspect of modern life, from the safety of your food and water to the security of your home, to the simple fact that minor injuries don't routinely become life-threatening infections. The next time you flip a light switch, take a hot shower, or visit a doctor for a routine checkup, remember that these simple actions represent the culmination of centuries of human progress. Remember that countless generations lived and died without access to these basic comforts, and that your ability to live without constant fear of death or disease is a historical anomaly that most humans throughout history could never have imagined. Medieval times weren't just difficult or inconvenient. They were actively hostile to human life in ways that most modern people can't comprehend. Your survival for even a single day would require not just luck, but an almost miraculous combination of circumstances that aligned in your favor. And that's why you wouldn't survive a day in medieval times. Not because you're weak or unprepared, but because medieval life was fundamentally incompatible with human survival as we understand it today. It was a world where death was always one mistake, one accident, one illness away, and where the only real question wasn't whether you would die, but when and how. So the next time someone tells you they wish they could live in a simpler time, remind them that simple doesn't mean safe, and that the past, for all its romantic appeal, was a far more dangerous place than most people realize. Be grateful that you live in an age of antibiotics and indoor plumbing, of food safety regulations and emergency medical services, of human rights and social safety nets, because once you truly understand what medieval life was like, you'll never take modern life for granted again. That wraps up another deep dive into history's most fascinating and terrifying realities here at Professor Archive. If this journey through medieval times has left you with a new appreciation for modern conveniences, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We've got plenty more historical nightmares to explore together. From ancient plagues to forgotten disasters, we'll continue uncovering the truths that textbooks often leave out. What historical period would you least want to survive? Let us know in the comments below, and remember, every time you turn on a tap and clean water comes out, you're experiencing a miracle that medieval people could never have imagined. Until next time, this is Professor Archive, reminding you that the past is a fascinating place to visit, but you definitely wouldn't want to live there.